When I was a young man, gods, it seems like it was ages ago. I can hardly recall what youth feels like anymore. But when I was young, perhaps the age of 25 seasons or so, I learned just what it meant to be a wizard. Many years before then, as a child, I'd always been fascinated by magic. My older sister, Triana, was a sorceress, and she discovered it one day, when she accidentally got her hand stuck in a wall. I'd heard her screaming from 2 miles off, as I had been in the creek near our homestead, catching frogs for dissection, as was a hobby of mine, dissecting creatures to see how they tick. I came running to her aid, and when I got there I saw my sister, screaming her head off, her left arm buried wrist deep into the stone wall of our grain tower. Not buried as if she plunged her hand into it, no, but rather buried as if she materialized suddenly with her hand within its molecular structure, for that is exactly what had occurred. She, until that point, had been unaware of her sorceress nature, having not yet had it show itself, but that day she learnt it well. It took 3 wizards, who traveled by teleportation from the Tower of Arcane Might in Mulmaster to our tiny hamlet in the prairie lands of Cormyr, at the great expense of our father, who was not happy about any of it at all, to get her hand out of that wall. It became evident to all of us very quickly that getting a hand free, which has been fused molecularly with a stone wall, is in itself an impossible task, for the 3 mages, who were all 3 very accomplished and dedicated wizards of high renown, could not free her hand by magic, at least, not in the way that we all would have liked. Years later, as I watched my sister stare at her stump of an arm from across the dinner table, I forever would remember to keep my molecular structure intact at all times. Which brings me to my initial point, and that is, to be a wizard was a very great responsibility, one who is truly dedicated to the weave of magic, and honors its unpredictable nature, and values the abilities one learns as a wizard, must forever be responsible for all those who he practices his art around, always keeping in mind that wizards have a duty to prevent the harming of, and in fact must protect, those people from untoward damage, maiming, or death, and must forever take on the oftentimes difficult task of taking ownership of such occurrences, whenever they happened. As a Grand Magus of the 17th tier, I myself, at the age of 99 winters, had been responsible for 7 deaths, and over 30 serious injuries, of the people in or around my vicinity during times of magical castings. Granted, 6 of the 7 were killed purposefully, during times of battle, 5 of those during times of war, and most of the injuries I had caused were during those times as well. However, the single death which was caused by accident was poignant enough to scar me for the rest of my days, however many I had left, and I said a prayer to Ogma, the god of wisdom and knowledge, once per day, for the poor soul whose life had been taken by my fault. It didn't help that the soul I am referring to was not only a loved one, but also my first cousin, Preyus, who I had not seen ahead of time, when I casted a fireball towards a bugbear, who had been just about to slay Preyus with a particularly evil-looking club. Both bugbear and Preyus went up in a ball of flame, burnt to a crisp instantly. So the one consolation is that my beloved cousin didn't suffer greatly. The other slight consolation was that I was attempting to save Preyus from the fate I ended up consigning him to. It was a double-edged sword, so to speak, so however I reasoned it to be justified, it was no big help for me, and I had to live with the regret and the remorse every day of my life. These are the thoughts that ran through my mind as I pondered the item I had tasked my lackey to pursue, the Orb of Finality, as it was called by those who even knew of its existence, which thankfully were very few, for the orb was not a paltry item, not a scrying stone, or an evocation-focusing stone, as were most of the magical orbs in the realms, nor was it particularly valuable as a treasure. No, indeed not. It was a fact that the Orb of Finality was a very, very powerful magical item, so much so that it had been hidden from all who knew of its existence by a renegade wizard by the name of Bartholomeus Pharsalicus,
Bartholomeus had been a mage of the high tower of the Order of Whispers, and had been the first wizard to dare touch the orb for over 2,000 cycles. With that one moment that he held it aloft, an entire civilization was completely erased from existence. Over 2 million beings of the subterranean gnomish race of deep gnomes, which used to belong to the Underdark, and tended not to interact with the outside world very much, but still had importance to the ecostructure of Toril as a whole, were wiped out, cleaned from this physicality at the blink of an eye, and that was done by mistake, as the wizard Bartholomeus simply had the thought that he didn't want to see those gnomes again in his life, after they had robbed him of his spell book during a trading mission to the Underdark, to trade with the drow some coin for the poison powders that the Dark Elves were so renowned for creating, so that you, the reader, are not confused as to just how or why this happened. Allow me to impart upon you the nature of the Orb of Finality, created by an ancient race of beings called Ithilids, also known as Mind Flayers to the common folk. The Orb of Finality had in its very makeup the power to take even the smallest, most insignificant thoughts of any who held in within their hands, and immediately cause those thoughts to occur without delay, and with all finality. This means, whatever the thoughts of the one who possessed the orb, those thoughts would occur, just as instantly as the thought was made manifest. So too would the resulting occurrence. For example, let's say that you, the reader, held the orb in your palm, and being a typical person, in this hypothetical description, you had latent, and also intentional thoughts running through your mind. Every single one of those thoughts, whether they were even known to you or not, would be made manifest instantly. So, if you had recently been arguing with your spouse, for instance, and you thought to yourself, why did he, or she, have to be filled with so much hatred for you all the time? Well, the next thing you would experience would be your spouse, flying through the air at you, with a dagger slicing the air, only to plunge into your neck, killing you. Or, equally as horrible in another way, they might go and sleep with everyone who would have them, in order to hurt you on a personal level, as much and as badly as they could, and as often. For once the thought was made manifest by the orb, it was a finality, and that person would hate you forever, never forgiving you, and constantly harming you to the best of their ability, because they would hate you, thanks to your simple thought. Now, imagine, if you will, that you had a thought similar to the one Bartholomeus had. Imagine that you had a thought even more destructive than he did. Imagine, if you will, that your day that day had been extremely frustrating, and, that day, everything you tried to accomplish was a failed attempt, or a bad outcome. And imagine that you were in a sour and darkened mood. And imagine, for whatever reason, you had the Orb of Finality in your grasp, and thought to yourself, I sure do wish that none of this existed. Well, then you wouldn't be there any longer to think a thought at all, because everything that now exists would cease to be, and existence would, against all possibility, and the universal law of existence itself, become the opposite of what it is, and be non-existent. Then we, in the resulting paradoxical conundrum, would never have existed at all, and life wouldn't exist, and the stars and the trees, and elves, and anything, would not exist. And this was the danger of the Orb of Finality. It was likely the most destructive item ever designed, and it is my fervent belief that it was created by the Ithilids, specifically to cause that very outcome, the destruction of all that exists. You see, the Mind Flayers were, and still are, beings of a pure evil, diabolical, methodical. They hate everything and everyone who is not of the Ithilid species, and for all we truly know, they hate themselves too. Ithilids are a humanoid race, tall and pale-skinned, living in the Underdark, very deep, deeper than the Dark Elves, and even deeper than the now extinct Deep Gnomes. Yet, They are not of this world. You see, they are multidimensional beings who have terrorized the multiverse with their sick, demented evil Forians. As I have done extensive research on the Orb of Finality, I have learned much about the Mind Flayers, as the two topics are not really separate. If one has never seen a Mind Mage, then it is likely that you won't grasp the true power of a wizard who can cast intricate spellwork without speaking an incantation or gesturing with arcane hand can't. The Mind Flayers are referred to as such because they are psionicists. Psionics being the study of what is called mental magic or psionic magic. It is a very difficult and, indeed, relatively unknown art form. Now, let us say that one was a Mind Flayer. You'd appear as a humanoid, with a monstrosity for a visage, like that of a very horrendous-looking octopus-like creature, with tentacles that surround and keep hidden a tube-like mouth, covered by a sharp and very disgusting beak, all hidden by the aforementioned tentacles. Imagine you are walking through the Underdark, through a city like Mezzo-Durazan. All around you is human suffering, and indeed, following behind you, on chains around their necks, are enthralled elves, humans and halflings. Like Walking Dead, they have been mind-flayed by your psionic attacks, and are completely dead in the mind. Aside from the motor control and basic awareness that they are still alive, you are taking them to a slave port, on the edge of the city, to sell them as basic automatons to some drow slave traders, for only a small amount of coin. But since you have fed on their brain matter, for that is what you eat, and have used them for any sort of purpose they had, you are content to rid yourself of these husks. One of the elves was royalty of a high elf kingdom in Evermeet, an important and beloved prince. Two of the humans in tow were righteous paladins of Lathander, once the servants of the Morning Lord, now forsaken by their god, somehow, never to see the light of day again. You don't care what they once were, for you hate all that they ever have been. As in Ithilid, you view yourself as completely separate from the lesser beings that inhabit the world of Toril. It is just another simple little backwater world to you, and you don't care. If it were to end the next moment, you don't have the same kind of thought matrix as other beings on Toril do, even those like the dark elven traders you do business with, for they are also nothing to you. The way your neural pathways are designed is completely alien to anything on Toril. You think like a megalomaniacal dominator, dead set on the control and domination of all other beings, whether they are natives of Toril or some other world. It matters not. All other creatures are beneath you. For you, detestable abomination that you are arrogant beyond measure, and do not much care about anything but your own will and desire to dominate anything else with a sentient mind. Now, I have given you that descriptive metal imagery, so that you, my beloved reader, can grasp the nature of the Orb of Finality. If you were a hyper-intelligent, mentally disordered, yet also mentally powerful being, with the nature of the beings I just described to you, and you had the ability to create an item, which upon touch, can transmute and transcendentally weave the energy of thought into a manifest destiny, would you not create that orb to be diabolical in design? Yes, you would, and wouldn't much care if this reality ceased to exist, for you would exist in many of them at once already. Therefore, it fell to me, having already realized the realizations I am now hoping you will see, as I did, to take up the task of, firstly, finding the Orb of Finality, then once found, taking it into my possession, without activating it the one way one can, by touch or proximate positioning, since one can activate it, even with gloves on, and technically not be touching it. And I'm not absolutely certain, but I do believe that one can activate the orb by putting any part of their body within a few centimeters of it, without physically touching it. At any rate, it is a risk I am not willing to take, so I have devised certain precautions, so that it won't activate inadvertently. Now, the young man I have under my employ, the rogue and thief, Denner Voss, he is the other part of my plan, for he, with his shadowy nature, and ability to go about unseen, unheard and relatively unknown by the vast majority, through use of subterfuge, disguise, magic and raw, pure and skillful talent, is the perfect candidate for the transport of the orb to the location, once found, that it must be taken, in order to keep it hidden from those who would be watching. For, let us make no mistake, it is under scrutiny, and there will be eyes upon the orb, especially if it is discovered to be missing, or if it is scribed by another wizarded, or psionic mage, meaning the mind flayers. For, you must be aware, if one would again put themselves into the so-called shoes of a mind flayer, that if one would have created such an item, with the intent and the hope that it be activated by pretty much any being on Toril who can initiate a thought, then one would most definitely be watching for such activity, would they not? The answer is a resounding affirmative. They would be, and they are indeed, watching. That is why it has been moving around over the past 4 or 5 cycles. Someone has been scrying it, and through doing so, has become aware that I have been trying to pinpoint it as well. But now, you see, I have solved the issue. I have now become certain that it is in a location where it will not be moving again. For whomever is working for, or with, the mind flayers, whether they know they are or not, cannot risk moving it too often, or too many times, for they will eventually come across a problem that will put the orb at risk, or cause the activation of its power. And I do not believe that anyone, even those working with the mind flayer villains, would be foolish enough to allow the orb to become active, knowing what the likely outcome would be. No, it won't be moving again, and not only because of the risk to the orb itself, or the activation of it either, but also because, I believe, of its current location. For upon initiating a focused scrying of the orb once again, just a couple of hours prior to now, I found its location to be in a most peculiar place. It is somewhere just off of Sawn Street, if not at the loft I sent my good lackey, Denner, to retrieve it from. If he is able to find it this time, then it can only be one other place that would make any kind of sense, and that, my good reader, is at the mansion of the Hewlin of Selgaunt himself, Hewlin Geoffrey Thomas II, ruler of not only our fine city, but of all Sembia. If that is the case, I am intrigued to find out why. I would hate to think that our ruler, sexual deviant though he is, would ever dream of being involved, even on accident, with beings of such disgusting villainous nature as the mind flayers. There's nothing for it now, but to wait and bide my time, and continue to attempt to come up with improved ways to go about procuring the orb safely. I'll await the return of my good man, Denner, who, I must say this, so that you understand it as well, has never let me down. Not once, and he is the only person I have ever been able to say that about. For one would tend to believe, since Denner is a rogue and a thief, that he may lack honor, or fall short of honesty. Yet, neither of those things is true. Quite the contrary. I have not known a man who has been more honest than he, nor do I know anyone with a more developed sense of honor than he. I've lived just shy of 1 century, shy by half a season, and just barely that. And in my 99 3/4 winters alive on the face of Toril, I have never been able to trust anyone, as much as I trust that young man. I care not if he is a thief, and in fact, I am glad of it. It is thanks to his chosen profession that I have been able to fund this endeavor to save all of existence from inevitable doom, or in truth technically, the lack thereof, though I do believe that doom would fall into the category of not existing at all, for I can't think of a worse fate than never having a fate to begin with. I can't think of a worse doom than never existing to be doomed in the first place. No indeed, this we cannot allow. So, I will go back to work now, and wait, with trepidation and excitement, my friend, agent of existence, Denner Vos, to return, so that we may plan the next step in reaching our successful outcome, that of saving all that is, from becoming all that never was.